Welcome! I'm so glad you're here today because what I'm about to share with you is not just an English lesson. It is a career-changing, deal-saving, income-transforming lesson that the most successful business professionals in the world use every single day, and most English learners never hear about it in a classroom. Let me start with a story. Imagine you are sitting in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor of a building in Singapore. Outside the window, the city is glittering. Inside the room, the air is tight. Across the polished table sits a senior executive from one of the largest technology companies in Southeast Asia. You have been working toward this deal for 7 months. 7 months of emails, phone calls, presentations, and relationship building. And now, right here in this room, everything is on the line. You take a breath. You look at the executive, and then you say the words that you've been preparing to say for weeks. We need this price. This is our final position. We cannot move. And just like that, just like the air being pulled out of a room, you can feel the energy shift. The executive's jaw tightens. His assistant stops typing. There is a long, uncomfortable silence. And then, very quietly, very politely, the executive says, "I understand. We'll need to discuss internally and get back to you." He never gets back to you. The deal dies. Now here is the question I want you to think about before we go any further. Was the deal lost because your price was too high? Was it lost because the product wasn't good enough? Was it lost because the relationship wasn't strong? No. The deal was lost because of your syntax, because of the way your sentence was built, because you used the language of ultimatums instead of the language of possibility. And that, right there, is exactly what we are going to fix today. Walking into a boardroom with rigid demands is the fastest way to kill a multi-million-dollar deal in 2026. You aren't losing because your value is low, you're losing because your syntax is too blunt. And today, I am going to show you how to replace "I need" with strategic conditional phrasing to pivot any high-stakes friction into a collaborative win. My name is Lilly, and welcome to this English learning lesson. Today's topic is one of my absolute favorites because it sits at the beautiful intersection of grammar, psychology, culture, and real professional power. We're talking about negotiation nuance, specifically how to use conditional phrasing to handle the most difficult, high-pressure moments in professional business deals. Here is what you are going to learn today. First, we're going to look at why absolute, direct demands create psychological friction and why that friction kills deals in the modern business world. Second, we're going to break down the architecture of if-then logic, the mechanics of how conditional sentences work in English, and why they are so powerful in professional settings. Third, we're going to explore how to navigate pivot points, those critical moments in a negotiation when you feel the conversation hardening and you need to steer it in a new direction, fast. Fourth, we're going to talk about how conditional language builds long-term, sophisticated rapport, especially in cross-cultural business environments where communication styles are completely different. And fifth, the section I know you've all been waiting for. We're going to walk through the final closing sequence and give you a practical toolkit for securing the outcome you want. This is a long, rich, deeply useful lesson, so get comfortable, grab your notebook, and stay with me all the way through, because the most powerful insight in this video comes near the end, and it is something that almost no one is teaching English learners about professional negotiation language. Are you ready? Let's begin. Section 1. The friction of absolute demands. Why direct, rigid language stalls modern deal. Let's start at the very beginning, because if you don't understand why rigid language fails, you won't fully appreciate why conditional language succeeds. Think about the last time someone said something to you that felt like a wall. Maybe a colleague said, "This is how we do things here." Maybe a vendor said, "Take it or leave it." Maybe someone in your personal life said, "I'm not changing my mind." How did those statements make you feel? If you're like most people, those statements didn't make you feel open. They didn't make you feel collaborative. They made you feel blocked. They made you feel defensive. And probably, if you're honest, they made you feel a little bit of resistance. That feeling you get when someone makes an absolute statement? That has a name in psychology. It's called psychological reactance. Let me explain what that means, because this is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about today. Psychological reactance is the automatic human response to feeling like your freedom or your choices are being taken away. When someone says to you, "You must do this," or "There is no other option," or "This is our final position," your brain doesn't say, "Oh, great, that was simple." Your brain says, "Wait a moment, who are you to tell me there are no other options? Let me push back." It doesn't matter how logical the statement is. It doesn't matter if the person is completely right. The moment a human being feels that their freedom to choose is being restricted, they instinctively resist. Now think about how dangerous this is in a negotiation. If you walk into a high-stakes deal and your language is full of absolute statements, "We need this price," "This deadline is non-negotiable," "We cannot adjust the terms," you are doing something very specific to the person across the table. You are triggering their psychological reactance. You are making them feel cornered. And a person who feels cornered does not collaborate with you. A person who feels cornered looks for the exit. This is why so many business deals fail, not because of the substance of the deal, but because of the language used to present it. And here's the part that makes this especially important for English learners. In many cultures and languages, being direct and clear is seen as a sign of strength, honesty, and professionalism. So when speakers come from those cultural backgrounds and they communicate in English, they bring that directness with them. And in certain English-speaking business environments, especially in global, cross-cultural deals, that level of directness can be perceived very differently than intended. It can come across not as strength, but as rigidity. Not as honesty, but as stubbornness. Not as professionalism, but as an unwillingness to collaborate. This is not a personal failure. This is a linguistic gap, and once you understand it, you can bridge it immediately. The winner-take-all mindset versus agile deal-making in 2026. Let me give you some context about how the business world has changed, because understanding this context will make you a far more effective communicator. For much of the 20th century, business negotiations were structured around what we might call the winner-take-all mindset. The idea was simple. There is a fixed pie, and the goal of negotiation is to get as much of that pie as possible. One side wins, the other side loses. Or at minimum, the goal is to give away as little as possible while extracting as much as possible. This mindset produced a very specific kind of negotiation language that was assertive, language that was firm, language that communicated strength through certainty. You didn't say maybe in a negotiation because maybe meant weakness. You said, "This is our position," and you held it. But something fundamental has shifted. In the 2026 global business landscape, the deals that succeed, the partnerships that last, the contracts that get renewed, the relationships that generate long-term value are not built on winner-take-all thinking. They are built on what experts now call agile and elastic deal-making. Agile deal-making means being flexible. It means being willing to explore different configurations of the same deal. It means understanding that the original terms on the table are a starting point, not a finish line. It means recognizing that the person across the table has their own pressures, their own constraints, their own organizational politics, and that a truly successful deal finds a way to work for both sides. Elastic deal-making goes one step further. It means the deal itself can expand and contract in response to changing circumstances. Instead of locking everything into rigid, fixed terms, elastic deals build in flexibility, conditions that allow the agreement to adapt as the business environment evolves. Now, and this is the key insight for today's lesson, both agile and elastic deal-making require a specific kind of language. They require language that is exploratory rather than declarative, language that opens doors rather than closes them. Language that says, let's figure this out together, rather than, here are the terms, accept them or don't. And the grammatical structure that achieves this most powerfully? The conditional sentence. But before we get to the architecture of conditional sentences, and we will get there, I promise, I want to stay in this section a little longer and talk about something that many English learners find surprising. How small grammatical adjustments release pressure. Here is something that fascinates me about language: the difference between a statement that creates conflict and a statement that creates collaboration is often just 2 or 3 words. Let me show you what I mean. Consider this sentence: we need a 30% discount. Now consider this sentence: if we were to move forward with a larger initial order, would a 30% discount be something you could explore? The content, the essential ask, is identical. You want a 30% discount. But the way those two sentences land in a conversation is completely different. The first sentence makes a demand. It positions you as someone who is asserting a requirement. The other party must either meet the requirement or refuse it. There is no middle ground. There is no collaborative space. It is a wall. The second sentence does something completely different. It creates a hypothesis. It says, here is a possible world. In this possible world, we do something for you. In return, there might be something available for us. Let's explore this possible world together. Notice what happens to the psychology of the conversation. Instead of triggering reactance, instead of making the other party feel like their freedom is being restricted, the second sentence invites them into a collaborative problem-solving exercise. It says, we're on the same team. Let's see if we can build something that works. And here is the truly beautiful part. You haven't given anything away. You haven't lowered your price. You haven't changed your requirements. You've simply reframed the conversation from a conflict into a collaboration. This reframing, this pivot from ultimatum to hypothesis, is what small grammatical adjustments can achieve, and it is the core skill we are going to build throughout this entire video. Now let me share something with you that I think will really open your eyes. Most English learners study grammar as a set of rules. Conditional sentences are often presented as a structure: if plus past simple, would plus verb. You memorize the structure. You practice writing examples. Maybe you take a test on it, and then you move on to the next grammar point. But here's what most grammar books never tell you. Conditional sentences are not just a grammar structure. They are a psychological tool, a relationship tool, a negotiation tool. And in the hands of a skilled communicator, they are one of the most powerful instruments in the entire English language. Let me say that again because I want it to really land. Conditional sentences are not just grammar. They are power. And in the next section, we're going to take them completely apart and put them back together in a way that gives you that power immediately, practically, and in the most professional way possible. But first, I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge something. I know that some of you listening to this right now are thinking, Lily, this sounds complicated. I'm still working on my English fluency. How am I supposed to master advanced negotiation language on top of everything else? I hear you, and I want you to know this lesson is designed for you. The examples we're going to work through are practical, repeatable, and usable even if your English is at an intermediate level. You don't need to be a native speaker to use these techniques. In fact, some of the most skilled negotiators I've ever studied are non-native English speakers, precisely because they learn to be thoughtful about their language rather than relying on instinct. So stay with me, we're just getting started, and the most useful material is coming up very soon. And if you're enjoying this lesson so far, if you can already feel how valuable this topic is for your professional life, please go ahead and hit the like button on this video. It truly helps us reach more English learners who need exactly this kind of content. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a lesson. Now let's move into Section 2, where we're going to build the architecture of conditional language from the ground up. Section 2, the architecture of if-then logic. How conditional sentences create a safe space for negotiation. Welcome to the heart of this lesson. In this section, I want to do something a little different. I don't want to just explain conditional sentences to you. I want you to feel how they work. I want you to sense the difference in your body between hearing an ultimatum and hearing a hypothesis. Because when you understand conditional language at that level, not just intellectually, but emotionally, you will never use rigid language in a professional context again. Let's start with a simple thought experiment. I'm going to say two things to you. After each one, I want you to notice what you feel. Ready? Here's the first one. You have to decide by Friday. Now here's the second one. If we could have a decision by Friday, we'd be in a position to hold these terms for you. Did you feel the difference? The first statement puts pressure on you. It gives you a deadline as a command. It doesn't offer you anything. It doesn't explain why Friday matters. It just tells you what you have to do. The second statement does something completely different. It connects your action, making a decision by Friday, to a benefit for you, having the terms held. It creates a small, logical world. If this, then that. It gives you a reason. And because it gives you a reason, it feels less like a demand and more like an offer. Same information, same deadline, completely different emotional experience. This is the magic of the conditional structure. And it's something you can learn to do in English with remarkable ease once you understand the mechanics. Breaking down the conditional structure. Let's get technical for a moment, just long enough to make sure we're all building on the same foundation. Don't worry, I'll make this as clear and accessible as possible. In English grammar, conditional sentences are sentences that describe a condition and its result. They follow an if-then pattern. The if part is called the conditional clause. It describes the condition. The then part is called the result clause. It describes what happens if the condition is met. Now, there are different types of conditional sentences in English, but for today's professional negotiation context, we're going to focus on three of the most powerful ones. The first type, the real conditional, for possibilities you genuinely believe can happen. This type uses if with a present tense verb in the conditional clause and will or can in the result clause. For example, if you can commit to this volume, we will adjust the pricing. This structure is used when you believe the condition is genuinely achievable. It says, this is real. This is possible. Here is what I can offer if you meet this condition. It's direct without being harsh. It's conditional without being vague. In a negotiation context, this structure works well when you are relatively confident about where things are heading and you want to make a concrete offer. The second type, the hypothetical conditional, for exploring possibilities without commitment. This type uses if with a past simple verb in the conditional clause and would, could, or might in the result clause. For example, if we were to extend the contract by 2 years, we might be able to look at a different fee structure. Now, this is where things get really interesting for professional negotiation, because this structure does something almost magical. It allows you to explore a possibility without committing to it. Notice the language carefully. If we were to, not if we do. We might be able to look at, not we will. This entire sentence exists in a hypothetical space. It's a thought experiment. It's an exploration. And because it's hypothetical, neither party is locked into anything. The speaker hasn't promised a different fee structure. They've only said that in this imagined scenario, it might be worth exploring. This gives both sides room to breathe, to think, to consider, without any loss of face if things don't work out. In negotiations, this is incredibly valuable. It allows you to float ideas and test reactions without the risk of making a formal offer that you then have to retract. The third type, the distanced conditional, for suggesting possibilities without pressure. This type uses similar past tense structures, but often includes additional softening language. For example, were there to be some flexibility on the delivery timeline, I could see us exploring a more favorable payment arrangement. Notice how formal and non-threatening this sounds. Were there to be is an even more hypothetical, more distanced phrasing than if there were. It creates maximum psychological safety. It signals that you're speaking about a very theoretical possibility, not making a direct demand. This structure is particularly powerful in high-stakes situations where the relationship is delicate, where the other party is very senior, or where you are operating in a cross-cultural context where directness is considered impolite. Now, let me pause here and give you a really important practical insight. Most English learners, when they want to negotiate in English, reach for one of two options. Option 1. They use very direct language because it feels clear and honest. I need this. We want that. Our position is this. Option 2. They use very uncertain language because they don't want to seem aggressive. Maybe we could possibly consider, I'm not sure, but perhaps neither of these serves you well. Direct language can trigger reactance. Uncertain language signals weakness. Conditional language, particularly the second and third types we just discussed, occupies the perfect middle ground. It is assertive without being aggressive. It is exploratory without being vague. It communicates that you have a position, that you are open to dialogue, and that you are sophisticated enough to know the difference between a demand and an invitation. This is the linguistic space where the best deals are made. The power of modal verbs, would, could, and might. Let me spend some time on a specific part of conditional language that I think is underappreciated by English learners, the modal verbs. In English, modal verbs are helping verbs that express different shades of meaning, possibility, ability, willingness, obligation. For professional negotiation, the three most important modal verbs are would, could, and might, and the differences between them are subtle but absolutely crucial. Let's explore each one. Would, the language of conditional willingness. Would is perhaps the most powerful modal verb in negotiation English because it signals conditional willingness. It says, under the right circumstances, I am willing to do this. Examples. We would be open to that arrangement if the terms were adjusted. I would consider a longer payment window in exchange for a volume commitment. That would work for us, provided the delivery schedule remains intact. Each of these sentences communicates a genuine willingness, but a willingness that is conditional. There is a requirement, there is a condition. And because the willingness is conditional, it doesn't feel like a concession. It feels like a carefully managed exchange. Could, the language of conditional ability. Could is the conditional form of can, and it signals conditional ability. It says, under the right circumstances, this is something I am able to do. Examples. We could potentially look at adjusting the scope if the timeline were extended. I could bring this back to my team if we had something more concrete to discuss. That could be an option, depending on the volume commitment you have in mind. Notice how could feels slightly less committed than would. Would says, I am willing. Could says, I am able, though I haven't decided yet. This distinction is incredibly useful in negotiation because it allows you to signal openness without signaling agreement. Might, the language of conditional possibility, might is the most tentative of the three, and it is perfect for moments in a negotiation when you want to explore an idea without committing to it at all. Examples. There might be some room to work with on that point. We might be in a position to offer extended support if the contract period were longer. That might be something worth exploring if the initial terms were revised. Might says, this is a possibility I'm not ruling out, but I'm not promising anything. In early stages of a negotiation, or in moments when the conversation needs to be slowed down and examined carefully, might gives everyone permission to think out loud without anyone making a commitment. Now here's something I want you to really internalize because it's going to change the way you speak in professional settings. When you combine these modal verbs with conditional if clauses, you create sentences that are simultaneously firm and flexible. Firm because they communicate that you have requirements and conditions. Flexible because they invite collaboration and signal that you are open to finding a solution together. This combination, firmness plus flexibility, is what sophisticated negotiators call being principled but elastic. And it is exactly the quality that the most successful dealmakers in the world project in their language. Let me give you a complete example to illustrate this. Imagine you are in a negotiation about a technology services contract. The client wants a 20% price reduction. You cannot give 20%, but you have some flexibility. Here is how the conversation might go with conditional language. Client: we were really hoping for something closer to 20% off your standard rate. You: I understand that would be very attractive from your budget perspective. If we were to structure this as an annual rather than a monthly arrangement, I could see us getting to something in the range of 12 to 15%. And if there's also a possibility of bringing in your secondary division under the same umbrella, we might be able to explore something closer to what you have in mind. Would either of those directions be worth discussing further? Let's analyze what just happened in that response. You did not say yes to 20%. You did not say no to 20%. You created two hypothetical pathways, each with a condition attached. You communicated that you are willing to move, but that movement requires something in return. And you ended with a question that invites the client into the conversation rather than putting pressure on them. That is the architecture of conditional negotiation language in action. But wait, there's a dimension to this that most people completely miss, and it has to do with the psychology of how people process information. From ultimatum to hypothesis, preserving authority while inviting collaboration. Here's a profound insight about human communication that I want you to carry with you through the rest of this lesson. When you make an absolute statement, "This is our final price," you do something to the conversation that is almost irreversible. You draw a line. And once a line is drawn, both parties know it's there. If the other party disagrees, the only options are to cross the line or to retreat from it. And crossing or retreating from a line always involves some loss of face. But when you make a conditional statement, if we were to maintain this price point, we would need to see a corresponding adjustment in the payment terms. You don't draw a line, you open a door. You say, "Here is a possible world. Here are the rules of that world. Would you like to step inside and explore it with me?" And here's the critical difference. In a conditional space, there is no line to cross. There is no face to lose. If the other party doesn't like the world you've described, they can simply propose different terms for a different world. The conversation remains fluid. The relationship remains intact. This is what I mean when I say conditional language transforms ultimatums into hypotheses. An ultimatum is a closed statement. Accept it or reject it. There is no middle ground. There is nowhere for the conversation to go. A hypothesis is an open statement. It says, if this, then that. What do you think? Does that work for you? What would need to change for this to work? A hypothesis keeps the conversation moving. And in negotiation, a moving conversation is almost always better than a stalled one. But, and this is the subtle but crucial point, a hypothesis is not the same as a concession. When you use conditional language, you are not giving anything away. You are exploring, you are testing, you are gathering information. And all of that exploration happens in a hypothetical space that allows you to step back out of it if necessary without losing any ground. Let me give you an example of this. You say, if we were to reduce the scope of the project in phase 1, we might be able to hit the budget figure you've mentioned. The client says, we actually need the full scope in phase 1. The timeline is the issue, not the scope. And you say, I understand. In that case, let me think about what flexibility might exist on our end regarding the timeline. Notice what just happened. You floated a hypothesis, reducing the scope. The client rejected the hypothesis, they need the full scope. But because it was a hypothesis and not a firm offer, you haven't given anything away. You can now pivot to a completely different dimension, the timeline, without any loss of face. You were simply exploring. Now you're exploring in a different direction. This is the art of conditional negotiation language, and once you master it, you will find that you almost never get truly stuck in a negotiation because there is always another hypothesis to explore. Now I want to give you a series of practical phrases that you can start using immediately. I'm going to organize them by situation so that you have clear guidance on when to use each one. When you want to float an idea without committing to it, if we were to look at this from a different angle, hypothetically speaking, if the terms were adjusted in that direction, I'm just thinking out loud here. If we were to consider, one possibility that might be worth exploring is, what if, when you want to signal willingness without making a formal offer, there could be some flexibility on our end if we would be open to revisiting that point under certain circumstances. I might be in a position to bring something different to the table if that's not something we've ruled out entirely. It would depend on when you want to attach a condition to something the other party wants. That could certainly work for us, provided that if you're looking for movement on that point, the question I'd need to put to my team is, we could get to that number if there were corresponding movement on the. That's achievable. It would, however, require us to revisit the when you want to slow a conversation down and create thinking space. Before we go any further on this, I'm curious. If we were to step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture, what if we took a slightly different approach and explored, I want to make sure I understand the full picture before we respond. Would it make sense to? There might be a way to look at this differently. What if? I want you to notice something about all of these phrases. They are all forward-moving. They are all collaborative. They are all respectful. And they are all conditional. They never say, no, that's not possible. They say, here is a different world. Here is a different possibility. Here is a different hypothesis. Let's explore it together. This is the language of sophisticated, high-level professional negotiation, and it is completely available to you as an English learner, regardless of your level, as long as you understand the mechanics and the psychology behind it. In the next section, we're going to apply all of this theory to real-world scenarios. Specifically, we're going to look at those critical pivot moments in a negotiation when the conversation starts to harden and you need to steer it in a new direction fast. But I want to stay here for just one more moment because there's something else I need to share with you before we move on. I've been talking about the mechanics of conditional language, but there's an emotional component to this as well that I think is just as important. Because the most powerful thing about conditional language in negotiation is not just what it does to the conversation, it's what it does to you. When you speak conditionally, you feel less anxious, you feel less defensive, you feel less like you're in a battle and more like you're in a collaboration. And when you feel less anxious, you think more clearly, you listen more carefully, you notice opportunities you would have missed if you were focused on defending a rigid position. Conditional language, in other words, doesn't just change the conversation, it changes how you show up in the conversation. And showing up as a calm, clear, collaborative professional, that is perhaps the most powerful negotiation advantage there is. All right, are you ready to take everything we've learned so far and apply it to the real world? Let's move into Section 3, Navigating the Pivot Points. Section 3, Navigating the Pivot Points. When deals start to harden and what to do about it. Here's something I've noticed about negotiations that I think most people don't talk about enough. Negotiations don't usually fail all at once. They don't usually explode in a dramatic moment of conflict. Most of the time, they fail gradually. They harden. They slow down. The energy in the conversation shifts, almost imperceptibly at first, from collaborative to guarded. And if you're not paying attention to the right signals, you won't notice what's happening until it's too late. But if you know what to listen for, if you know the verbal and tonal cues that signal hardening, you can intervene with the right language at exactly the right moment. And that intervention can save a deal that everyone else thought was already dead. This section is about teaching you to hear those signals, and then it's about giving you the precise linguistic tools to respond to them. The verbal cues of a hardening negotiation. Let me give you a vocabulary lesson that is unlike any vocabulary lesson you've had before. These are the words and phrases that tell you a negotiation is starting to close down. When you hear these, you need to act, and you need to act with conditional language. Signal 1. Absolute frequency language. This is when the other party starts using words like always, never, every time, not once, or in all our years. Examples: we have never paid more than that rate for this service. That's always been a fixed requirement for us. In every contract we've signed, we've maintained this clause. What this language tells you: the other party is signaling that they feel their position is backed by history and precedent. They're not making a flexible request. They're telling you this is a matter of principle. What you need to hear beneath the language: they're anxious. They're trying to strengthen their position by invoking consistency and history. This often means they feel vulnerable on this point. What to do: acknowledge the history, then gently open a conditional door. Response example: I completely understand that's been the consistent standard, and I respect that consistency. I wonder, though, if there were circumstances where adjusting that framework actually created a better outcome for both sides, would you be open to at least exploring what that might look like? Notice what you've done. You've acknowledged their history. You haven't challenged their precedent. You've simply opened a hypothetical door, if there were circumstances, and invited them to walk through it with you. Signal 2. Finality language. This is when the other party starts using words like final, absolute, non-negotiable, bottom line, last offer, or take it or leave it. Examples: this is our final offer. That clause is absolutely non-negotiable. I've taken this as far as I can. This is the bottom line. What this language tells you: the other party feels they've reached the limit of what their organization will allow, or they want you to believe they have. They're trying to end the exploration phase and force a decision. What to do: do not respond to finality with finality. That creates a standoff. Instead, honor their position while gently introducing a different dimension. Response example: I appreciate you being that clear with me. It helps me understand exactly where things stand. I'm wondering, though, if there might be a way to look at this from a slightly different direction. If we were to table this specific point for now and explore whether there are other elements of the arrangement that could create more value for both sides, would that be worth a few minutes of conversation? What you've done here is masterful. You haven't accepted their final offer. You haven't challenged it. You've suggested moving temporarily away from the sticking point and exploring other dimensions of the deal. This gives both parties breathing room, and it often reveals that the non-negotiable point is actually quite negotiable once the right context has been established elsewhere in the deal. Signal 3. Withdrawal language. This is when the other party starts to physically or verbally withdraw from the conversation. Signs include: I'll need to take this back to my team. We might need to reconsider our involvement at this stage. I'm not sure we're going to be able to find alignment here. What this language tells you: the other party is not rejecting you. They are creating distance, either to buy time, to signal dissatisfaction, or to test whether you'll concede. This is a negotiation tactic, not a final decision. And if you treat it as a final decision, you'll lose the deal unnecessarily. What to do: don't panic. Don't concede immediately, and don't let the withdrawal become permanent. Response example: I completely understand, and I want to make sure we're making the best use of everyone's time before you take this back to your team. Could I ask, if there were 1 or 2 adjustments to what's currently on the table that would make this a more compelling conversation for your team, what would they be? This response does several powerful things. It validates their need to consult internally. It signals that you're listening and you want to help them make a good case internally. And it asks a question that invites them to tell you exactly what they need, which is information you can then use to structure your next offer conditionally. Signal 4. Comparison language. This is when the other party starts referencing competitors or alternatives. Examples: your competitor has offered us something significantly better. We've had proposals from 3 other vendors, and honestly, yours isn't the strongest. At this price point, we have other options we're considering. What this language tells you: this could be a real situation. They genuinely have better offers. Or it could be a tactical move to create pressure and leverage. In either case, your response needs to be the same: calm, confident, and conditional. What to do: Never respond defensively. Never attack the competitor. Instead, redirect to the unique value you offer and use conditional language to open a new dimension. Response example. I appreciate you sharing that. I'd always rather know where we stand than guess. I'm curious about something. If our proposal could demonstrate comparable or superior value in the areas that matter most to you, perhaps not on price alone, but on some combination of quality, service, and strategic fit, would that change the conversation? Notice the conditional structure. If our proposal could demonstrate, you're not saying it currently does. You're asking them to imagine a world in which it does, and you're asking whether that world would be worth exploring. Real-world scenarios, pivoting without losing face. Now, let me take you through 3 complete real-world scenarios. In each one, I'll show you how a professional might traditionally respond, and then how they could respond using conditional language to preserve the deal. Scenario 1. The price standoff context. You are selling a professional consulting service. Your rate is $500 per hour. The client has a budget ceiling of $350 per hour and has stated this firmly. Traditional response. I understand your budget, but we can't work below our standard rate. $500 is our price. Result. Hard stop. Nowhere to go. Conditional response. I appreciate you being so clear about the budget. That's genuinely helpful. Let me think through this with you. If we were to structure the engagement differently, perhaps focusing the high-intensity consulting hours in the first 2 months and transitioning to a lighter advisory model in months 3 and 4, I could explore whether we might be able to build something that respects your per-hour ceiling on certain phases. Would that kind of structured approach be worth exploring? What happened? You didn't lower your rate. You proposed restructuring the engagement so that different phases might have different pricing. You created a hypothetical architecture for a deal that could work within their stated constraints without giving anything away yet. Scenario 2. The timeline dispute. Context. You are a project manager. The client wants the project delivered in 6 weeks. Your team's minimum timeline is 10 weeks. The client says 6 weeks is a hard requirement. Traditional response. 6 weeks is not realistic for a project of this scope. We need 10 weeks minimum. Result. Direct contradiction of their stated requirement. Tension increases. Conditional response. I want to make sure we deliver something that genuinely meets your needs, and I also want to be honest with you about what's realistic. Here's a thought. If we were to define a core deliverable that could be ready at the 6-week mark, something fully functional and genuinely useful, and then continue developing the full scope through week 10, would that kind of phased delivery address the underlying urgency you have? I'm wondering if there's a time-sensitive event or launch at week 6 that's driving this. What happened? You didn't reject their timeline. You proposed an alternative, a phased delivery that meets their timeline requirement for a meaningful deliverable while preserving your team's realistic timeline for the full scope. And you asked a question that reveals the real reason behind the 6-week requirement. That information is gold. Scenario 3. The contract clause dispute context. You are negotiating the terms of a partnership agreement. The other party insists on an exclusivity clause that would prevent you from working with their competitors. This is unacceptable to your business. Traditional response. We can't agree to exclusivity. That's off the table. Result: flat refusal. The other party is now facing a direct challenge to a condition they clearly feel strongly about. Conditional response. I understand why exclusivity would be attractive from your perspective. It protects your investment in the relationship, and I respect that. I want to explore whether there might be a way to address the underlying concern without a blanket exclusivity clause. If we were to define a specific scope of protected work, certain service categories or client segments where we would commit to giving you priority, would that address the core of what you're trying to protect? I'm very open to building in meaningful protections. I just need to make sure the structure works for both of our businesses. What happened? You didn't refuse exclusivity. You acknowledged what the clause is trying to achieve, protecting their investment. And then you opened a conditional pathway to address that underlying concern in a different way. You replaced a binary yes or no on exclusivity with a collaborative exploration of how to protect their interests without harming yours. The art of mirroring their pain points back as conditions. There's one more technique I want to teach you in this section, and it's one of my personal favorites because it requires both deep listening and sophisticated language, and when you get it right, it is incredibly powerful. It's called mirroring through the conditional. Here's how it works. In any negotiation, the other party will reveal their concerns, their pressures, and their pain points throughout the conversation. Sometimes explicitly. Our main concern is cash flow. Sometimes indirectly. We've had issues in the past with vendors who overpromised on timelines. Sometimes almost accidentally. We're under a lot of pressure internally to show results quickly. Most negotiators hear these pain points and immediately think, how can I use this to my advantage? But the truly great negotiators, the ones who build long-term relationships and close deals that others can't, do something different. They mirror the pain points back through a conditional structure. What this means in practice is this. You take the concern the other party has expressed, their fear, their pressure, their requirement, and you build a conditional sentence that shows you understand it and that you are prepared to address it. Let me show you examples. They say, we've been burned before by projects that went over budget. You mirror, if I could show you a structure where cost overruns were contractually capped on our end rather than passed to you, would that address some of the concern you're describing? They say, our board is going to want to see results within the first quarter. You mirror, if we built a 90-day milestone into the agreement with clearly defined deliverables, would that give you the evidence you need for your board review? They say, our main challenge is that we have limited internal bandwidth to manage this kind of relationship. You mirror, if we took the project management entirely off your plate, dedicated a single point of contact on our side who handles all the coordination, would that make this kind of partnership more viable for you? Do you see the pattern? You are taking their pain point, the thing they are worried about, the reason they are hesitant, and you are building it into a conditional offer. You are saying, in effect, I heard what worries you. If I could eliminate that worry, if I could address that specific concern, would you be willing to move forward? This is one of the most effective negotiation techniques in existence, and it requires conditional language to work properly. You can't say, we will cap cost overruns. That's a concession made under duress, and it will be received accordingly. But if I could show you a structure where cost overruns were capped on our end, would that address the concern? That's a hypothesis. That's an invitation. That's collaborative problem solving. The content might be the same. The psychology is entirely different. All right, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground in this section. You now know how to identify the verbal signals of a hardening negotiation. You know how to respond to those signals with conditional language. You know how to pivot from a standoff to a collaborative exploration without losing face. And you know how to mirror pain points back as conditional offers. Let me pause here and say, if you're finding this video genuinely useful, I'd love for you to share it with a colleague or a friend who works in business. This kind of content takes a lot of work to create, and knowing it's reaching people who really need it makes it so worthwhile. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have many more lessons just like this one. Now, let's move into one of the most nuanced and fascinating sections of this entire lesson, the topic of sophisticated rapport and cross-cultural communication. Section 4, Maintaining Sophisticated Rapport. How conditional language builds long-term professional trust. I want to share something personal with you. I have had the privilege of working with business professionals from dozens of different countries. Professionals from Japan and Germany and Brazil and Saudi Arabia and the United States and South Korea and France and Nigeria and India. And one of the most interesting things I've observed across all of these different cultural contexts is this: the language of conditions, the language of if and would and might and could, is remarkably universal. Not universal in the sense that all cultures use it in exactly the same way. That's not true, and I'm going to explore the cultural differences in a moment. But universal in the sense that across all of these cultures, people instinctively understand the difference between a demand and a hypothesis. They instinctively recognize when someone is offering them a door to walk through rather than a wall to push against. And that recognition, that felt sense of being invited rather than cornered, is the foundation of what I call sophisticated rapport. What is sophisticated rapport? Sophisticated rapport is different from ordinary friendliness. In a professional negotiation context, ordinary friendliness is easy to achieve. You smile, you make small talk, you express interest in the other person's business. These things are valuable, and I don't want to minimize them, but they are surface-level connection. They are the opening chapter of a relationship. Sophisticated rapport goes deeper. It is the sense that the person across the table is someone who thinks at the same level as you, someone who understands complexity, someone who appreciates nuance, someone who is capable of holding multiple possibilities simultaneously rather than forcing everything into a binary. And nothing communicates sophisticated rapport more powerfully than the skillful use of conditional language. Here's why. When you use conditional language well, when you say things like, "If there were room to explore this from a different angle, I might be in a position to approach this differently," you are demonstrating several things simultaneously. You are demonstrating emotional intelligence, the ability to understand and manage the emotional dynamics of the conversation. You are demonstrating strategic sophistication, the ability to think several steps ahead and explore multiple scenarios. You are demonstrating respect for the other party by treating them as a thinking, complex individual rather than simply an obstacle or a target. And you are demonstrating professional maturity, the understanding that the best deals are built on mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. All of these qualities, emotional intelligence, strategic sophistication, respect, professional maturity, are communicated not through what you say, but through how you say it. And the how is conditional language. This is why when people say that top global executives have a certain quality, a certain gravitas, a certain presence in a negotiation room, what they are often responding to is not just confidence or knowledge. They are responding to the way these executives use language, the way they never seem to be backed into a corner, the way they always seem to have another option, another angle, another hypothesis to explore. That quality can be learned. That quality is conditional language. The nuances of cross-cultural negotiation. Now let me address something that is critically important for anyone working in international business, and particularly for English learners who are navigating the complexity of English as a global business language. Different cultures have very different approaches to directness, confrontation, and the expression of disagreement. And if you don't understand these differences, if you bring your home culture's communication norms into an international negotiation without adjusting, you risk serious misunderstandings. Let me walk you through some of the key cultural dimensions and explain how conditional language helps you navigate all of them. High context versus low context communication cultures. In communication research, scholars talk about the distinction between high context and low context cultures. In low context cultures, the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Australia, Scandinavia, communication tends to be explicit and direct. Meaning is primarily carried in the words themselves. If you want to say no, you say no. If you want to propose something, you state it clearly. Ambiguity is generally seen as unhelpful. In high-context cultures, Japan, China, Korea, many Middle Eastern countries, much of Latin America, many Southeast Asian and African nations, communication is much more indirect. Meaning is often carried not in the words, but in context, tone, relationship history, and what is not said. A direct no is considered rude and relationship damaging. Instead, disagreement is expressed through hedging, through suggestion, through silence, through reference to constraints. Now, here is the fascinating thing about conditional English. It actually functions beautifully in both high-context and low-context environments. In low-context environments, conditional language is valued because it is precise and logical. It provides clear conditions and clear outcomes. The if this, then that structure appeals to the preference for explicit, logical communication. In high-context environments, conditional language is valued because it is indirect enough to be comfortable. If there were room to adjust, does not force anyone to say yes or no. It allows everyone to save face. It keeps the conversation alive without requiring any party to make a definitive statement they might need to retract. This is one of the reasons why conditional language is so universally effective in international business. It works with both communication styles simultaneously. Let me give you some very practical examples. Negotiating with Japanese business partners. Japanese business culture places enormous value on harmony, group consensus, and the avoidance of direct confrontation. A direct no from a Japanese counterpart is extremely rare. Instead, they might say something like, "That would be difficult," or "We would need to consider this further internally," or simply pause in silence. If you don't recognize these signals, if you interpret "that would be difficult" as "let me think about it" rather than "that's a no," you will waste enormous amounts of time pursuing a deal that has already been declined. And conversely, when presenting your own requirements, using direct "we need" language in a Japanese business context can make you seem unrefined and culturally insensitive, even if you are perfectly polite in terms of your content. Conditional language bridges this gap perfectly. Instead of "we need delivery by the end of Q2, you say, "If it would be possible to explore a Q2 delivery timeline, we would certainly be very interested in discussing how that might work." Instead of "we can't accept those payment terms, you say, "I wonder if there might be some flexibility on the payment schedule that we could explore together." These phrasings feel natural in a Japanese business context because they avoid direct confrontation. They leave everyone room to consider and respond, and they demonstrate a level of cultural sophistication that builds immediate trust. Negotiating with German business partners. German business culture values precision, thoroughness, directness, and an expectation of expertise. German professionals appreciate when you know your subject deeply and can discuss it in specific, detailed terms. They are comfortable with directness, but they distinguish between directness that is professional and directness that is aggressive. In a German business context, conditional language works in a slightly different way. Rather than using it to avoid confrontation, you use it to signal analytical rigor. You're not softening your position, you're demonstrating that you've thought through multiple scenarios. For example, if we were to commit to that payment structure, the corresponding adjustment I would need to propose would be an extension of the warranty terms by 12 months. That would ensure the risk is appropriately balanced across both sides. This kind of conditional language communicates to a German business partner that you've done your homework, that you understand the implications of different deal structures, and that you are prepared to discuss the logical consequences of each scenario. That is exactly the kind of professional behavior they respect. Negotiating with Brazilian business partners. Brazilian business culture places great value on personal relationship, warmth, and emotional connection. Business decisions in Brazil are often as much about whether you trust and like someone as they are about the specific terms of a deal. And the pace of relationship building in Brazilian business is typically much slower and more personal than in, say, the United States or Germany. In this context, conditional language serves a different purpose. It allows the conversation to flow naturally and spontaneously while still managing the substantive elements of the deal. It feels less transactional and more conversational. You know, if we were to look at this together over the next few weeks and really understand each other's priorities, I think we might find a way to put together something that genuinely works for both sides. That sentence, in a Brazilian business context, communicates partnership. It says, "I'm not in a rush. I'm here to understand you. And together, we can figure this out." That relational quality is deeply valued. Negotiating with American business partners. American business culture values speed, clarity, confidence, and tangible results. American professionals often want to move quickly, make decisions efficiently, and see clear value propositions. The long, discursive negotiation style that might be preferred in some other cultures can feel frustrating to American counterparts. In this context, conditional language should be crisp, concrete, and results-oriented. If we can close the scope agreement by end of week, I'm confident we can have a proposal with your preferred pricing structure in front of you by Monday. Here's what I can offer. If the contract term goes to 24 months, I could lock in the current pricing with a built-in review at 12 months. Would that work? American business culture responds well to conditional language when it's direct and action-oriented. The condition is clear, the result is clear, the next step is clear. That's the culture speaking. Using conditional language to shape your professional brand. There's one more dimension of this section that I want to explore, and it's one that I think very few people think about consciously, but that actually has enormous long-term impact on your career. Every time you speak in a professional context, you are building your professional brand. Every email you write, every meeting you facilitate, every negotiation you participate in, you are creating an impression of who you are and how you work. And that impression accumulates over time into a reputation. The question is, what kind of reputation do you want to build? Most people, when they think about professional reputation, think in terms of expertise, results, and relationships. And those things matter enormously. But there's another dimension of professional reputation that is often overlooked: the reputation for how you handle difficulty. How do you behave when a deal gets hard, when a negotiation stalls, when someone says no, when the other party is being unreasonable? The professionals who are most valued, the ones who get called back, the ones who get referred, the ones who build the most lasting relationships, are the ones who handle difficulty with grace, with sophistication, with a calm, collaborative approach that never loses sight of the long-term relationship, even in the midst of short-term conflict. And conditional language is one of the primary tools that creates that impression. When you respond to a difficult moment in a negotiation with conditional language, when you say, "I hear that this is a challenge on your end. If there were a way to address that concern while still moving toward an outcome that works for both of us, I'd love to explore it," you are projecting several qualities simultaneously: empathy, creativity, professionalism, and confidence. You are not fighting. You are not retreating. You are offering a path forward, and that is the reputation you want to build, not as a hard-nosed, win-at-all-cost negotiator, not as a pushover who gives away everything to keep the peace, but as a sophisticated, principled, collaborative professional who can find solutions where others see only obstacles. That is the reputation that opens doors. That is the reputation that leads to the best long-term deals. And that is the reputation that conditional language, used skillfully, helps you build every single day. Now, I want to give you one more set of practical phrases before we move into our final section. These are phrases specifically designed to reinforce sophisticated rapport at key moments in a negotiation. When you want to signal empathy and understanding, I can see why this position makes sense from your perspective. If I'm putting myself in your seat for a moment, that concern makes complete sense to me. What if we explored whether there's a way to address it that works on both sides? I want to make sure I fully understand what's driving that requirement. If I'm reading this right, what you're most concerned about is when you want to signal collaborative intention. I think we're closer than it might seem right now. If we step back and look at the overall picture, what I'd love for us to do is find an arrangement that we're both genuinely pleased with, not one where either side feels they've given away too much. If we approach it from that angle, I'm committed to finding something that works. If you can help me understand what the ideal outcome looks like for you, I'll work to see how close we can get. When you want to signal long-term thinking. I'm thinking about this not just in terms of the current deal, but in terms of where our two organizations could go together over the next few years. If we establish the right foundation here, what I care most about is building a relationship we can both rely on. If the terms we're discussing today create a foundation for that kind of partnership, I think that's worth a small adjustment on our part. Great long-term partnerships are built on both sides feeling they've been treated fairly. If there's something on the table today that feels imbalanced, I'd rather address it now than have it create friction later. These phrases are not just language tools, they are relationship investments. They communicate that you are thinking about the other person, about the long term, about the shared outcome, not just about your own position. And in a world where trust is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable, that kind of communication is priceless. Let me also take just a moment here to do something important. If you've been watching this video and finding it genuinely valuable, I'd love to ask you to do two things. First, hit the like button if you haven't already. It helps this content reach more people who need it. And second, subscribe to this channel so you can continue learning with us. We create content specifically for English learners who want to thrive in professional environments. And the lesson I'm about to share with you in the final section, the closing sequence, is something I think you're really going to value. Don't go anywhere. Section 5. Securing the favorable outcome, the final closing sequence. Alright, we have traveled a long distance together in this video. We've talked about why rigid language stalls deals. We've explored the architecture of conditional sentences. We've navigated pivot points and cross-cultural nuances. We've discussed how conditional language builds sophisticated rapport. Now we're going to bring all of that together into something tangible and immediately actionable. The final closing sequence. This is the moment in a negotiation when hypotheses become agreements, when exploration becomes execution, when conditional language transitions into firm, committed, contractual language. And navigating this transition skillfully is what separates a professional who almost closes deals from one who actually closes them. Let me walk you through the sequence step by step. Phase 1, the consolidation summary. Before you can close anything, you need to make sure that both parties have a shared understanding of what has been agreed in principle during the conditional exploration phase. This is more important than most people realize. In negotiations, especially long ones, it's very easy for both parties to be slightly different in their understanding of what's been discussed. One party thinks a concession was firm, the other party thinks it was merely hypothetical. One party thinks a timeline was agreed, the other party thinks it was just one of several options on the table. If you go into the final closing phase with these misalignments in place, you will hit unexpected resistance at exactly the moment when you thought you were about to close. The consolidation summary is how you prevent this. It sounds like this. Before we move into looking at how we document this, I want to make sure I'm representing where we've landed correctly. Based on our conversation today, my understanding is that we've provisionally agreed to a 24-month contract term, a pricing structure that adjusts at the 12-month mark based on volume, a payment schedule of net 45 days, and a scope that includes Phase 1 delivery and a defined Phase 2 to be scoped separately. Is that an accurate summary of where we are? Notice several things about this summary. First, the language is still slightly provisional, provisionally agreed. My understanding is. You're not stating a fait accompli, you're confirming a shared understanding. This leaves room for either party to gently correct any misalignment without it feeling like a confrontation. Second, the summary is specific. It doesn't say, we've agreed on price and timeline, it states the actual numbers and structures. This specificity is important because it forces both parties to engage with the actual content of what's been agreed rather than a vague impression of it. Third, it ends with a question. Is that an accurate summary? That invites the other party to confirm or correct. This is a moment of collaborative checking, not a unilateral declaration. If the other party says, "Yes, that's right," you can proceed with confidence. If they say, "Actually, I think the pricing adjustment was at 18 months, not 12, you've caught a misalignment before it became a problem. Phase 2. Transitioning from conditional to committed language. This is one of the most subtle and important moments in the entire negotiation arc, and it's one that many people get wrong. During the exploration phase, all of your language was conditional. If we were to, there might be, we could potentially. This was deliberate and appropriate. You were exploring, not committing. But now that you've reached a point of genuine agreement in principle, you need to begin transitioning your language from conditional to committed. Because if you maintain conditional language all the way to the contract signing, you'll signal to the other party that you're not actually sure you want to close, and they may pull back. The transition looks like this. Instead of, "If we were to agree to the 24-month term, we might be able to look at that pricing structure," you now say, "Based on what we've discussed, we're committing to the 24-month term, and the pricing structure we've outlined reflects that." Instead of, "There might be some flexibility on the payment schedule," you now say, "We've agreed to net 45 days, and that's what I'll have reflected in the documentation." Instead of, "That could potentially work for us," you now say, "That works for us. Let's make sure it's captured accurately in the agreement." Do you hear the difference? The conditional exploration phase is over. Now you are in the commitment phase, and commitment phase language is firm, clear, and action-oriented. This transition, knowing when to shift from conditional to committed, is one of the hallmarks of a truly skilled negotiator. Go too early, and you risk closing something that isn't fully ready, creating buyer's remorse and later disputes. Go too late, and you leave the other party uncertain about whether you're actually ready to commit, which creates its own kind of anxiety. The consolidation summary is your bridge. Once you've done the consolidation summary and both parties have confirmed the shared understanding, that's your signal that it's time to transition to committed language. Phase 3, the conditional close. Here's a technique I want to share with you that is both simple and remarkably effective, the conditional close. Even in the commitment phase, there are often one or two remaining sticking points, things that haven't been fully resolved and could potentially derail the deal at the last moment. The conditional close addresses these by making the final commitment contingent on the resolution of these last points. It sounds like this: "Everything we've discussed today feels aligned, and I'm ready to move forward. The only thing I'd want to confirm before we proceed is the support escalation clause, specifically the response time commitments. If we can confirm that the 48-hour response time applies to Tier 1 issues and 24 hours to Tier 2, then I'm in a position to authorize the agreement on our end." Notice what this does. It signals readiness to close. I'm ready to move forward. It identifies the remaining sticking point precisely, the support escalation clause, and it states the condition that needs to be met for final commitment. If we can confirm that. Once the condition is met, the commitment is unconditional. This is a fundamentally different approach from leaving the sticking point unresolved and hoping it will work itself out in the documentation. That approach almost always creates problems. The conditional close surfaces the remaining issue, resolves it, and then closes cleanly. Another version of the conditional close for situations where you want the other party to make the final move. "I think we're very close. If you're able to confirm the warranty terms by end of week, I'll have our legal team proceed with the documentation immediately." This version puts the ball in the other party's court for the final resolution. You've signaled you're ready. You've identified what you need. You've committed to immediate action once it's provided. This creates a clean, clear path to closure. The negotiation script audit, a self-assessment checklist. Now I want to give you something incredibly practical that you can use immediately in your own professional life. This is a self-assessment checklist for auditing your own negotiation language. Whenever you are preparing for an important negotiation or reviewing how a negotiation went afterward, go through this checklist and be honest with yourself. Before the negotiation. Question 1. Have I identified my key requirements and the conditions under which I would be willing to adjust them? This is essential groundwork. You need to know your own conditions before you can speak about them conditionally. What are the things that are truly non-negotiable for you? And what are the things that are important but potentially adjustable given the right circumstances? Question 2. Have I prepared conditional language for each of my key requirements? For each thing you want, you should have a conditional sentence ready. If condition, I would, could, might be open to adjustment. This preparation means you'll never be caught off guard and resort to blunt language under pressure. Question 3. Have I identified the likely pain points of the other party? Based on your research and your understanding of their situation, what are they likely to be worried about? What pressures are they likely to be under? What have been the sticking points in similar deals in the past? Having answers to these questions means you'll be ready to mirror their pain points back through the conditional when the moment comes. Question 4. Have I thought about the cross-cultural context? If you are negotiating with someone from a different cultural background, have you considered how their culture approaches directness, disagreement, and face-saving? Have you adjusted your language style accordingly? During the negotiation. Question 5. Am I listening for the verbal cues that signal hardening? As the conversation progresses, actively monitor for the signals we discussed earlier: absolute frequency language, finality language, withdrawal language, comparison language. The moment you hear any of these, you know it's time to pivot. Question 6. Am I responding to friction with conditional language? When the conversation gets difficult, check yourself. Are you instinctively reverting to blunt, declarative language? Or are you maintaining the conditional frame that keeps the conversation collaborative and fluid? Question 7. Am I staying curious? The best negotiators are relentlessly curious. They are always asking why, not aggressively, but genuinely. Why is this particular point so important to them? What is driving this requirement? What would change if we approached this from a different angle? Curiosity, expressed through questions and hypotheses, is what keeps a conversation alive. After the negotiation, question 8. Did I successfully transition from conditional to committed language at the right moment? Reflect on how the closing phase went. Did you pivot to committed language clearly and at the right time? Or did you maintain conditional language for too long, leaving the other party uncertain? Or did you try to close too early, before the exploration phase was complete? Question 9. Were there moments when I used blunt language, and what was the result? Be honest with yourself about the moments when you fell back on direct, declarative statements. What was the reaction? How did the energy in the conversation shift? What could you have said differently? Question 10. What conditional phrases or strategies worked particularly well, and which ones felt awkward? The more you negotiate, the more you'll develop your own personal style. Some people naturally gravitate toward, "I wonder if," as a conditional opener. Others prefer, "if we were to," or "what if we looked at." Pay attention to the phrases that feel natural to you and that seem to land well with the other party. Over time, your negotiation language will become richer, more varied, and more instinctive, but it all starts with this deliberate, conscious practice. How conditional language drives closing rates and better margins. I want to close this section with something that might surprise you. You might think that conditional language, being flexible, being exploratory, being willing to adjust, would lead to worse outcomes. If you're always open to negotiation, won't people take advantage of you? The research says the opposite. Studies of professional negotiators consistently find that the negotiators who achieve the best long-term outcomes, not just in a single deal, but across their careers, are the ones who are most collaborative in their language and most flexible in their exploration. The hard bargaining, take it or leave it style produces short-term wins, but damages relationships and closes doors to future opportunities. Conditional language drives better outcomes for several reasons. Reason 1. It keeps the conversation alive longer. A conversation that continues is a conversation in which a deal can be found. A conversation that ends prematurely because one party used language so blunt that the other party felt they had to walk away is a conversation where no deal is possible. Conditional language keeps the door open, which keeps the possibility of a deal alive. Reason 2. It generates more information. Because conditional language invites the other party to participate in problem solving, it generates more information. You learn more about their priorities, their constraints, their pain points, and their underlying interests. And the more information you have, the better positioned you are to structure a deal that genuinely meets their needs, while also meeting yours. Reason 3. It creates reciprocity. When you approach a negotiation with collaborative, conditional language, the other party tends to reciprocate. They become more open. They share more. They are more willing to explore possibilities. And a negotiation where both parties are genuinely exploring possibilities together is one where the best deals get made. Reason 4. It preserves the relationship. Even when a deal doesn't close, a negotiation conducted with conditional language leaves the relationship intact. The other party may not be in a position to agree today, but they remember that you were professional, collaborative, and respectful, and they come back to you when circumstances change. Reason 5. It signals premium value. There is something paradoxical about conditional language. Using it skillfully actually signals that you are confident about your value. You don't need to make ultimatums because you know your offer is strong. You can afford to be collaborative because you know the other party needs what you have. Conditional language, when used with confidence and precision, communicates premium positioning. This last point is subtle but powerful. Think about it in the context of the restaurant example. The most expensive, sought-after restaurants in the world don't say, "We have availability on Tuesday, take it or leave it." They say, "We'd be delighted to accommodate you on Tuesday at 8. If that timing doesn't work for you, let's see what else we might be able to arrange." The language is courteous and collaborative, but it is also completely confident. There is no desperation, no pressure, no ultimatum, just an elegant conditional offer. That is the energy that conditional language conveys when used from a place of genuine confidence. And that is the energy that attracts the best deals, the best clients, and the most favorable terms. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, and I know it might feel like a lot to absorb at once, so let me bring it all together for you in a clear, memorable summary. Here are the 5 key lessons from today's video. Lesson 1. Rigid language creates psychological reactance. When you use absolute declarative statements in a negotiation, "we need," "this is final," "take it or leave it," you trigger the other party's instinct to resist. You make them feel cornered, and a cornered person doesn't collaborate, they look for an exit. This is why so many deals fail not on substance, but on syntax. Lesson 2. Conditional language creates collaborative space. When you replace ultimatums with hypotheses, "if we were to," "there might be," "we could potentially," you invite the other party into a collaborative exploration. You create a safe space where ideas can be tested without commitment, where concessions can be explored without loss of face, and where both parties can work together toward a shared solution. Lesson 3. Modal verbs are precision instruments. Would, could, and might each carry different shades of meaning. Would signals conditional willingness. Could signals conditional ability. Might signals conditional possibility. Using them precisely and intentionally gives you extraordinary control over the tone and commitment level of every statement you make in a negotiation. Lesson 4. Know the signals of a hardening negotiation and respond immediately. Absolute frequency language, finality language, withdrawal language, comparison language. These are the verbal cues that tell you a deal is starting to close down. When you hear them, respond immediately with a pivot, a conditional sentence that acknowledges the other party's position while opening a new exploratory pathway. Lesson 5. Conditional language is a long-term reputation investment. Every time you respond to difficulty with calm, collaborative, conditional language, You are building a professional reputation as someone who handles complexity with grace. That reputation is worth more than any individual deal. It is the foundation of the most valuable professional relationships, the ones that generate business, referrals, and opportunities for years and decades. A final word on mastering this skill. I want to leave you with one more thought before we end today's video. Language is a skill. Like all skills, it requires practice. You won't walk out of this video and immediately use all of these techniques flawlessly in your next negotiation. That's not how learning works. What you will do, if you're intentional about it, is start to notice. You'll start to notice when you're using blunt language that could be conditional. You'll start to notice when the other party uses rigid language and how it makes you feel. You'll start to experiment in lower-stakes conversations first, with replacing "I need" with "if we were to." And gradually, over days and weeks and months of practice, conditional language will become natural. It will become instinctive. It will become the way you speak. And on the day when you're sitting in that glass-walled boardroom or on that Zoom call or in that email exchange and a deal starts to harden, you'll feel something different than you used to feel. Instead of anxiety, you'll feel readiness because you'll have a language, you'll have a toolkit, you'll have the words, and you'll know exactly what to say. Before I let you go, I want to make sure you know about something that can really accelerate your English learning journey. If you're enjoying this lesson, if this kind of professional English content is exactly what you've been looking for, then please don't forget to like this video, share it with a colleague who would find it valuable, and subscribe to our channel for more English learning videos just like this one. We are dedicated to creating content that helps you not just learn English, but use it powerfully in the real world. And your support means everything. And here's something else I want you to know about. If you'd like even more English listening and speaking practice, and particularly if you want to keep developing the kind of natural, confident English that works in professional environments, be sure to check out our podcast playlist on this channel. You'll find many rich, carefully designed lessons that help you improve your English in a natural, immersive way. It's perfect for your commute, your workout, or any time you want to keep learning without sitting at a desk. Find the podcast playlist on our channel page and start listening today. All right, that's everything for today's lesson. You came in here knowing that something about your professional communication wasn't quite working. And now you know what that something is, and you know exactly how to fix it. Go practice. Go experiment. Go into your next negotiation with the language of conditions, of possibilities, of collaborative hypotheses. And watch what changes. I'm Lily, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Keep learning, keep growing, and remember, every word you learn is a door that opens. Real dialogue examples for deep learning. This extended practice section is designed to give you even more exposure to conditional negotiation language in action. I'm going to walk you through several complete negotiation dialogues, analyzing the language in detail as we go. These dialogues cover a wide range of professional contexts, technology, finance, real estate, creative services, and international trade, so that regardless of your field, you'll find something directly applicable to your situation. As you read through these dialogues, I want you to do something specific. After each one, I want you to identify the conditional sentences, the modal verbs, and the pivot moments. That active engagement will accelerate your learning far more than simply reading passively. Let's begin. Dialogue 1. Technology Services Contract. Context. Maya is a business development director for a software company. She is negotiating a 3-year enterprise contract with David, the chief procurement officer of a large manufacturing company. They are deep in the negotiation, and the conversation has just hit a difficult moment. David: Maya, I appreciate the time you've invested in this process, but I have to be honest with you. Our CFO has reviewed the proposal, and the annual licensing fee is significantly above what we're prepared to spend. I'm going to need to see a substantial reduction before I can take this back to her. Maya: I appreciate that transparency, David. It helps me understand exactly where the challenge is. Before I respond to the pricing question directly, I'd love to understand a little more about what substantial means in this context. If the CFO is looking at the per-seat cost or the total contract value, that might affect which direction we explore. Both, honestly. The per-seat cost feels high compared to alternatives we've evaluated, and the 3-year total is a significant commitment at this stage. That makes complete sense. Let me think through this with you. On the per-seat cost, if we were to restructure the agreement so that the base licensing tier only includes your core user group, and we built a separate expansion tier that you could activate as your adoption grows, the headline per-seat figure could look quite different. Would that kind of tiered architecture be something that would resonate with your CFO's review? That's interesting. What would the expansion tier look like? We have some flexibility in how we structure those tiers, and I'd want to put together something that makes sense for your growth trajectory specifically. But in general terms, if your core deployment is, say, 500 seats to start, and then you have expansion access for up to 1,000 at a pre-negotiated rate that's locked in for the term of the agreement, you're essentially protecting yourself against price increases as you scale. Could that be a compelling story for your CFO in terms of financial predictability?
It could be. What about the 3-year term? That's also a sticking point. We typically prefer more flexibility in our vendor commitments.
I understand that preference, and I actually want to help you make the strongest possible case internally. Here's a thought. What if we structured this as a 3-year agreement, but with a formal review and renegotiation clause at the 18-month mark? That would give you a genuine off-ramp if circumstances change significantly, while still giving us the contractual horizon we need to offer the pricing we're discussing. Would having that structured review point make the 3-year commitment more palatable?
That's more workable. What would the pricing look like under this tiered structure?
If we build in the tiered architecture and the 18-month review clause, I could bring our enterprise team a proposal with a first-year per-seat rate that's meaningfully below the current number. And I'd like to think we could get to a place where the overall economics feel right for your CFO. Can we schedule a follow-up in the next few days where I bring you a revised proposal that incorporates these elements? I want to make sure I'm building something that reflects this conversation accurately rather than coming back with something generic. That works. Let's plan for Thursday. Perfect. And David, if there are 1 or 2 other points on the proposal that you know are going to be sticking points for your CFO, I'd love to know about them now so I can address them in the revised version. It'll save us time in the long run. Actually, yes. The service level agreement response times are also something she flagged. Noted. I'll make sure the revised proposal addresses that specifically. If I can show improved SLA commitments tied to the tiered structure, would that address most of the remaining concerns?
I think it would.
Excellent. Thursday it is. Let's pause and analyze what happened in this dialogue. Notice how Maya never once said, "We can't do that price." She never said, "Our SLAs are standard and non-negotiable." She never said, "3 years is a firm requirement." Instead, she turned every potential friction point into a conditional exploration. If we were to restructure, could that be a compelling story? What if we structured this as, "If I can show improved SLA commitments"? Every time David expressed a concern, Maya met it with curiosity. What does substantial mean in this context? And then immediately pivoted to a conditional pathway that addressed the underlying concern. The result? The deal is still very much alive at the end of the conversation. Both parties have moved forward. And critically, Maya has gathered a complete picture of everything she needs to address in the revised proposal. That is conditional language working exactly as it should. Dialogue 2. Financial Partnership Negotiation. Context. James is the CFO of a private equity firm. He is negotiating with Sophia, who represents a family office looking to co-invest in an acquisition. The conversation has become tense around the governance structure of the proposed partnership. James, I need to be direct with you. The governance structure you've outlined gives your firm majority decision-making authority on all exits. That's not something our principals are comfortable with. They have certain expectations around involvement in material decisions.
I appreciate you raising this directly, Sophia. I'd rather address it head-on than have it become an obstacle later. Can I ask, when your principals talk about involvement in material decisions, what specifically are they envisioning? I want to make sure I understand what meaningful involvement looks like from their perspective before I speak to what might be possible on our end. They want veto rights on any exit below a certain return threshold. They also want to be part of the conversation, not just informed after the fact, on any significant operational changes during the hold period. Those are both very understandable positions, and frankly, they're not far from where we'd ideally like to be as well. A co-investor who is engaged and aligned on governance makes for a stronger partnership. Let me think about how we might address this. On the veto rights, if we established a defined return threshold, let's say a net IRR floor that we negotiate into the partnership agreement, below which any proposed exit would require approval from both parties, would that address the substantive concern? The specific threshold would obviously need to be negotiated, but the structure itself seems like it could work.
That structure could work. The threshold number will be important.
Agreed. And on the operational involvement, what if we created a formal advisory board that included one representative from your side? Not an operating authority, but a structured forum for consultation on any material decisions. If your principals were regularly briefed and formally consulted rather than simply notified, would that satisfy their expectation of meaningful involvement without creating the structural complications of dual operating authority?
It would satisfy part of it. They would also want some kind of protective right if the operational direction changed significantly from the investment thesis they approved.
That's a reasonable protection to want. If there were a material divergence from the agreed investment thesis, and we'd need to define material carefully. But in principle, could we build in a redemption right for your principals that was triggered by that divergence? So they'd have an exit option if the strategy shifted in a way they weren't aligned with.
A redemption right on strategy divergence. That's actually quite interesting. I'd need to understand the valuation mechanics. Of course, if we tied the redemption valuation to a defined formula, say a trailing EBITDA multiple that we agree on up front, it would be objective and predictable, rather than subject to negotiation at the moment of friction. Would that kind of pre-agreed formula give your principals the confidence that the right is genuinely protective?
It would. I think there's something here we can work with, James.
I think so too. If you're open to it, I'd suggest we take the framework we've discussed today and have our respective legal teams draft the relevant clauses for review. We haven't committed to specific numbers yet, but we have a structure that I think addresses the core concerns on both sides.
That's a sensible next step. One thing, if there are any other structural points on your end that might come up during legal review, I'd prefer to know about them now.
Appreciated. The one area where I'd flag potential discussion is the information rights provisions. Our standard template has quarterly reporting and an annual audit. If that doesn't meet your principal's requirements, I'd like to understand what they need before legal drafts, rather than after. Could you check on that and let me know before we send the engagement letter?
I'll check today. In this dialogue, notice how James consistently demonstrates that he is genuinely trying to find a solution, not just defend a position. Every time Sophia identifies a concern, he acknowledges it as reasonable or understandable before introducing a conditional pathway. Also notice the progression of conditionality. Early in the conversation, if we established a defined return threshold, would that address the concern? He's exploring possibilities. Later, if you're open to it, I'd suggest we take the framework we've discussed today and have our respective legal teams draft the relevant clauses. He's moving into the commitment phase. The conditional language softens but doesn't disappear. It's still present in, if you're open to it.
This progression, from exploratory conditional to committed conditional to action, is the natural arc of a well-executed negotiation. Dialogue 3. International Trade Negotiation.
Context. Aiko represents a Japanese electronics manufacturer. She is negotiating the terms of a distribution agreement with Carlos, who represents a Brazilian retail group. There are significant cultural considerations at play. Aiko-san, I want to make sure we can find a way forward here. Our team has reviewed the proposed distribution margins, and we feel the current numbers don't fully reflect the investment we're making in your brand in our market. Thank you for raising this openly, Carlos-san. I appreciate your candor. Could you help me understand a little more about the investment you're referring to? I want to make sure I understand the full picture before we discuss whether there might be room to explore adjustments. Of course, we're planning a significant launch campaign, print, digital, and in-store, across 53 locations in the first quarter. We're also investing in training our sales team specifically on your product range. These are commitments we're making because we believe in the potential of this partnership. But for the economics to work for us, the margin structure needs to reflect those commitments. I see. I deeply appreciate that level of commitment, and I want you to know that is exactly the kind of partnership we're hoping to build in the Brazilian market. Let me share something with you. Our current margin structure was designed for a standard distribution arrangement, but the level of investment you're describing is well beyond standard, and if that commitment is reflected in the agreement, there might be some room to discuss a performance-linked margin enhancement.
What would that look like?
One possibility, and I want to be clear this is exploratory, as I would need to bring any specific numbers back to my team in Tokyo, would be a tiered margin arrangement. If your first-year sales volume exceeded a certain threshold, the margin rate could increase retroactively for the portion above that threshold. This would mean that your investment in the launch is rewarded proportionally if it generates the results we're both hoping for. Would a performance-linked structure like that be interesting to discuss further?
It could be. What would the base margin be in the first year before the threshold kicks in?
I can't commit to a specific figure in this conversation. That would need to be confirmed with our commercial team. But I can tell you that if the base is structured to be competitive with what you're typically seeing for comparable electronics brands in this category, and the performance enhancement is meaningful enough to significantly reward a strong launch, I believe we could build something that feels fair and motivating. Would you be willing to give us 2 weeks to come back with a specific proposal that incorporates this structure? 2 weeks works. And Aiko-san, on the exclusivity question, we had discussed regional exclusivity, and I want to make sure that's still on the table. I want to be honest with you about this because I think honesty is the right foundation for this partnership. Regional exclusivity is something our company approaches carefully because it limits our flexibility. However, if the launch commitment you've described is codified in the agreement, specific media spend, specific in-store presence, specific sales training, and if the first-year volume targets are achieved, I could see us bringing a very strong position on exclusivity to the table. If those conditions are met, exclusivity becomes a very natural conversation. Does that feel like a fair exchange?
It does. I'll have our marketing team put together the launch commitment details so you can take them back to Tokyo.
That would be very helpful. Carlos-san, I want to say one more thing. Our company has been very selective about the partnerships we form in South America. The fact that we are here, having this conversation, reflects the seriousness with which we view your organization and this market. If we are able to structure an agreement that reflects both our commitment to your market and your commitment to our brand, I believe we can build something that will be very significant for both of our businesses. I look forward to continuing this conversation. This dialogue beautifully illustrates cross-cultural conditional communication. Aiko's style is more indirect and relational than the previous dialogues. She uses phrases like, "I want to be honest with you," "I want to say one more thing," which reflect the high-context, relationship-oriented communication style that is often associated with Japanese business culture. But notice that the conditional language is still central. If that commitment is reflected in the agreement, there might be some room. If the base is structured, if the launch commitment is codified. Carlos, representing a relationship-focused culture as well, responds warmly to both the relational gestures and the conditional structure. The dialogue moves forward productively because both parties feel heard, respected, and genuinely engaged in collaborative problem-solving. Practice these techniques. Let me now give you some practical exercises to help you apply everything we've learned. These exercises are designed so that you can do them on your own right now with just a pen and paper. Exercise 1. Rewrite the demand. Take each of the following direct demands and rewrite it as a conditional offer. I'll do the first one as an example. Original. We need a 15% discount. Conditional rewrite. If we were able to commit to a larger volume in the first quarter, would there be any flexibility on the unit pricing? Now you try. 1. We need this project delivered by March 1st. 2. We can't accept liability for indirect damages. 3. Our company requires a 12-month exclusivity period. 4. We need dedicated support, not a shared help desk. 5. We won't sign a contract with an automatic renewal clause. Take a moment to write your conditional rewrites. Remember to use if with a past simple verb and would, could, or might in the result clause. Here are some suggested rewrites. 1. If the project were delivered by March 1st, we'd be in a position to authorize the next phase immediately. Is that timeline something we could explore together? 2. Were there a way to define the scope of liability more specifically, perhaps capping it at a certain value rather than excluding indirect damages entirely? I could explore whether that might work for our legal team. 3. If the relationship develops in the way we're both hoping, I could see exclusivity becoming a very natural conversation at the 12-month mark. Would you be open to building in a defined review point? 4. If dedicated support were included in the arrangement, the economics would need to reflect that commitment. Could we look at what a dedicated support tier might look like? 5. If the automatic renewal included a defined notice period for opt-out, say 90 days before renewal, would that address the core concern? Or is the structure itself the issue? Exercise 2. Respond to finality language. Someone in a negotiation says, "This is our absolute bottom line. We can't go any lower." Write 3 different conditional responses, each one taking a slightly different approach. One that explores a different dimension of the deal, one that mirrors their pain point, and one that uses a hypothetical question to open a new avenue. Exercise 3. Prepare your own conditional language. Think about a negotiation you have coming up, or one you recently participated in. Identify 3 moments in that negotiation where you said or would have said something direct and declarative. Now, rewrite each of those moments using conditional language. Pay attention to how it changes not just the words, but the feeling of the statement. Does it feel more collaborative? Does it feel less pressured? Exercise 4. Modal verb substitution. Take the following sentence and rewrite it 3 times. Once with would, once with could, and once with might. Notice how each version signals a slightly different level of commitment. Original sentence. We can look at adjusting the payment terms if the volume commitment is significant. With would, with could, with might. This exercise is particularly useful for calibrating the level of commitment in your conditional language, knowing when to use a stronger signal and when to use a softer one. Advanced techniques. Taking your conditional language to the next level. Now that you've built a solid foundation in conditional negotiation language, I want to share some advanced techniques that will elevate your skills even further. These are techniques used by the most sophisticated negotiators,
the kind of professionals who walk into a room and immediately earn a level of respect that opens doors before they've even said anything substantive. Advanced Technique 1. The reverse conditional. Most of the conditionals we've discussed are forward-moving. If you do X, we could do Y. The reverse conditional flips this, making the other party's action the result, not the condition. Standard conditional. If we reduce the timeline, would you consider adjusting the scope? Reverse conditional. What would need to change on our side for you to be in a position to adjust the scope? Notice the difference. In the reverse conditional, you are asking them to define the condition. You are inviting them to tell you exactly what they need from you to move forward. This is incredibly powerful because it does two things simultaneously. It signals that you are willing to move, and it asks them to tell you specifically what direction to move in. The reverse conditional is especially useful when you've hit a genuine impasse and you're not sure where the other party has flexibility. Rather than guessing, you're asking them directly, but in a way that doesn't feel like a concession. Advanced Technique 2. The stacked conditional. This technique involves layering multiple conditions in a single response to create a complex but logical proposal. If we were to extend the contract term to 3 years, and if the volume commitment in year 1 met a certain threshold, and if the support level were standardized at Tier 2 across the board, I think we might be in a position to look at the pricing in a very different way. Notice how 3 conditions are stacked together. Each one adds something to the deal from the other party's side, and together, they justify a significant movement on pricing from your side. This is the architecture of a value exchange. You're showing exactly what combination of factors would need to align for you to make a significant move. Stacked conditionals are particularly effective when you need to justify a large concession. Rather than simply dropping the price, you show the conditions under which a price drop becomes logical, which protects your professional credibility and establishes the move as a genuine exchange rather than a capitulation. Advanced Technique 3. The named hypothetical. This is a technique where you give a hypothetical scenario a name or a label, making it easier to refer to in subsequent conversation. Let me put a scenario on the table. Let's call it Option B. In this scenario, we extend the timeline by 6 weeks, increase the initial scope commitment, and adjust the payment structure to quarterly rather than monthly. Under Option B, I'm quite confident we could find a pricing arrangement that works for both sides. By naming it Option B, you've created a conversational shorthand. Later in the discussion, either party can say, "What if we came back to Option B?" Or, "Option B feels close. Is there any adjustment we could make to make it work?" The named hypothetical makes it easier to revisit and build on without having to reconstruct the entire scenario each time. This technique also signals a level of preparation and strategic thinking that immediately elevates your credibility in the room. Advanced Technique 4. The deferred conditional. Sometimes in a negotiation, you're not ready to respond to a difficult point. You need time to think, or you need to consult internally, or you simply want to gather more information before proposing anything. The deferred conditional is a graceful way to hold your position while signaling genuine engagement. That's a point I want to give a genuine, thoughtful response to, rather than something off the top of my head. If I could come back to you on this specific point after I've had a chance to consult with my team, would that be acceptable? I want to make sure any response I give you is something we can actually honor. This is far better than either making a commitment you're not sure about or saying something vague and uncertain. The deferred conditional signals that you take the point seriously, that you are going to consult appropriately, and that your eventual response will be trustworthy and actionable. Advanced Technique 5. The preemptive conditional. The best negotiators don't just respond to friction, they anticipate it and diffuse it before it becomes a problem. The preemptive conditional involves identifying a potential sticking point early in the conversation and addressing it conditionally before the other party raises it as a demand. I want to be transparent about something before we get into the details because I'd rather we address it proactively than have it become a stumbling block later. The payment timeline in our standard agreement is net 60 days. I know that's sometimes a point of discussion, and if it becomes one for us today, I want to let you know that there is some room to explore depending on the overall structure of the arrangement. So let's set that aside for now and see where everything else lands, and then come back to it if we need to. What has this done? You've surfaced a potential issue before it became a confrontation. You've signaled that you're aware of it and not hiding from it. You've indicated that there's some flexibility, conditionally, and you've suggested a process for dealing with it later. All of this in a single preemptive conditional. The preemptive conditional communicates strategic awareness and professional maturity. It says, I've thought ahead. I know where the friction points might be, and I have a plan for addressing them. That quality, the quality of someone who thinks ahead, is one of the most respected qualities in any professional negotiation context. Building your conditional vocabulary. As a final resource for this lesson, I want to give you a comprehensive vocabulary list of conditional phrases, organized by function. This is something you can bookmark, print, or save, and come back to whenever you're preparing for an important negotiation. Opening the conditional space. If we were to consider this from a different angle, one possibility that might be worth exploring is, what if we looked at this in a different way? I'm wondering whether there might be a way to, could we explore the idea of, hypothetically speaking, if we were to, let me put a thought on the table. What would it look like if, signaling conditional willingness? We would be open to that, provided that, that's not something we've ruled out, it would depend on. I could see us moving in that direction if, we'd be willing to explore that under the right circumstances. That might work for us depending on mirroring pain points. If I could address that specific concern, would you be open to? It sounds like what you're most concerned about is, if we could find a way to resolve that. If I'm understanding you correctly, the core issue is, in that case, what if we? The worry seems to be around, if we built in a specific protection for that. Proposing conditions. That could certainly work. The corresponding adjustment I'd need to see would be, I'd be in a position to consider that if there's flexibility there. It would, however, require, we could get to something close to that number if that timeline is achievable, provided that moving toward commitment. If we're aligned on these key points, I'd suggest we move to, given what we've discussed today, the next step would be, if your team can confirm those details, we'd be ready to proceed. Once we've documented these terms, I don't anticipate any other issues. If everything we've discussed today is reflected in the documentation, I'm comfortable moving forward. Closing conditionally. If you can confirm X, we're ready to sign. The only remaining item for me is, if we can resolve that, I think we have a deal. We're very close. If this one point can be addressed, I don't see any remaining obstacles. Everything looks aligned. If you're in the same place, let's get the documentation moving. This vocabulary is your toolkit. These are the phrases that will allow you to navigate even the most difficult professional negotiations with grace, confidence, and skill. But here's what I want you to remember as you close this video and go out into your professional world. Language is not just a communication tool. It is a relationship tool. It is a trust-building tool. It is a deal-making tool. And when you invest in the quality and intentionality of your language, when you shift from I need to if we were to, you are doing something that goes far beyond grammar. You are demonstrating that you understand people, that you respect the complexity of their situation, that you are genuinely interested in finding solutions, not just winning arguments, and that, more than any clever tactic or aggressive position, is what builds the most valuable, most enduring professional relationships. You've spent real time with this lesson today. That investment says something about who you are as a learner and as a professional. Now go take these tools and use them. Start small if you need to, but start. And come back and tell me how it goes. All right, my wonderful learners, we have reached the end of today's lesson, and what a journey it has been. We started by understanding why rigid language creates friction. We explored the architecture of conditional sentences,
if-then logic, modal verbs, hypothetical structures. We navigated the critical pivot points in a negotiation and learned how to respond to hardening conversations with grace and skill. We talked about sophisticated rapport and the nuances of cross-cultural communication, and we walked through the complete closing sequence, from consolidation summary to committed language to the final close. And along the way, I hope you've come to see conditional language not just as a grammatical structure, but as a philosophy that says every situation has more than one possible outcome, every impasse has more than one possible exit. And the person who finds those possibilities, the person who keeps asking, what if, is the person who closes the deals that others thought were impossible. That person can be you. I'm Lily, and I am so grateful you spent this time with me today. If you got value from this lesson, please like this video, share it with someone who could benefit, and subscribe to the channel for more lessons just like this one. And if you want to keep practicing your English in a natural, immersive way, please check out our podcast playlist. You'll find it right here on our channel. It's full of carefully designed lessons that help you build your listening, speaking, and professional English skills in a format you can take anywhere. Many of our listeners tell us the podcast playlist is where their English really started to click, so I'd love for you to check it out. Thank you for being here. Thank you for learning. And remember, every word you master is a step toward the professional life you're building. I'll see you in the next lesson. Keep going. You've got this.